Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Mind Movement Health podcast. Today on the show, I have a very special guest, Danielle. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm super excited about this conversation. We've had it sort of, in the diary for a while. And I think, being a type of athlete myself, coming through dance and all the rest of it, this is information I wish I had known when I was much younger. And I feel like there wasn't much of an emphasis on it. So before we dive into what we're going to talk about, can you share with the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. But before I start, I'm with you. I wish I would have had this when I was growing up as an athlete too, which is, I think, kind of what led me to this career path. So I'm from Anaheim, California, which is where Disneyland is. For those who are not familiar with the state of California and locations. So I'm Southern California, but my parents are Canadian. So they moved down to Southern California after they got married. My mom was recruited to be a nurse here. So they moved here, had my brother and I. And being Canadian, they got us involved in ice hockey very young. So my brother started when he was about 4 or 5. I started when I was about 5 or 6. And I played with boys until I was about 18 because that was all that we had here at the time in Southern California. We didn't have a lot of options, any options really, for girls back then. It's gotten so much better now, which is amazing to see. But back then, I played with boys until I was 18. And when I was about 12 or 13, there were two coaches that decided to go out and find all the girls who were like me, who were the only girl on their team. And they brought us all together, all from all over the state. And we created California Selects. And it was the first girls team, I think, in the state of California. And our sole purpose was to go to the East Coast and play in tournaments where we were put in front of scouts and recruits so that hopefully we could be recruited and end up, maybe getting a scholarship or getting offered, asked to go play college hockey on the East Coast. And so I played on both of those teams moving forward, and I was recruited, as were a lot of my teammates on that team. And I was recruited by multiple schools. I ended up choosing Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, which is a Division I school. I received a full ride to play there. I was there for 4 years. I was captain my senior year, and then after that, I moved up to Oakville, Ontario, Canada, and I played in the NWHL, the National Women's Hockey League, for 2 years for the Oakville Ice. And then after that, I moved overseas to Lugano, Switzerland, and I played professionally in the Swiss League for 2 years before finally returning home. I actually committed to a third year, but I was like, I need to figure out my life at this point, right? I had been prolonging the inevitable. So I moved back home and officially retired from professional play and went back to school and got my master's degree in sport and exercise psychology. And so I've been working with the athletes on the mental side of performance since about 2010-ish now. I started working with athletes when I was going through my master's program, but it's a really kind of a come full circle moment for me. And this is why I tell my whole story, because as an elite athlete myself, growing up and experiencing all the things, those invisible barriers that I experienced, I now get the opportunity to provide athletes with the tools to move past those things much faster than I was ever able to, because this wasn't a thing growing up. And the answer to a lot of those, the question and the barriers that we were against was to just get outside and practice more. And oftentimes that's not the case with sport being and performance being 80 to 90% mental. So I absolutely love what I do, working with my athletes and being able to kind of see little Danielle through them now. If I were to go back and have these kinds of things, it's wonderful. I'm also an author too. I wrote The Empowered Athlete. So that's my bio is not short. I apologize for that, but I do think it's important, and it kind of gives you a picture as to why I'm doing what I'm doing and how I got here.
Yeah, well, you mentioned, that you work with athletes, and I wanted to have you come on the podcast because, as we were sort of saying, the mental side of it, one of my questions is how much, if you are, even if you're a weekend warrior and you're just training, you mentioned that 80 to 90% of it is mental, whereas I would assume most people would think 80 to 90% of it is physical and the last 10% is mental.
Yes, and I don't think that that's a common misconception. Like or I mean, I do think that is a common misconception, where the majority of people do assume that it's all physical. And I'm not saying that it's not. Like obviously, we need to practice and we need to lift weights and we need to do all of those things and eat right. And there's so much that goes into making an athlete an athlete and so on and so forth. But the mind can sabotage everything. You could be the best, and I love to use the example of Simone Biles in the last Olympics. I'm sure most people watched it, where she removed herself from competition because her mind wasn't right. She is arguably the greatest of all time. It was in the best physical, probably still is the best physical shape of her life. She can do those routines in her sleep, but her mind wasn't where it needed to be, and doing the things that she's doing in that kind of a sport, she can severely injure herself, right? So I personally felt like she made, and doing what I do, she made the right choice pulling out and not continuing with competition, because like I said, the mind, it can sabotage everything. So that's a really good example of that 80 to 90% versus the 10 to 20% of the physical piece. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. And for the listeners listening in that are like, I'm not an athlete, like a professional athlete, but,
Mm,
you know, I like to run and I like to do half marathons, or maybe you
mm,
do a weekly dance class and you still do a performance, once a year. What do you want them to know? Or maybe they have a relative or a young niece or
yeah.
nephew or somebody that is an athlete. What do you want them to know?
To know about the mental side of performance.
Yeah, exactly. You like, what can
Yeah.
they do to help that side of their performance?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that they can do to help that side of performance. I think that just going back to the weekend warrior thing, where kind of to tie it into what you said before is how they might assume that, oh, that's not mental for me. Like it's not 80, 90% mental for me. I would argue that it is, because not every day are we motivated to get up and go for our runs. If we're training for a 5K or whatever it is, and I'm speaking from experience, there's days where I'm just like, meh, I don't feel like doing it right now. Right? But if you have too many of those days in a row, that 5K rolls around and you're not physically prepared, right? And that's the mindset piece, is understanding, okay, I'm not feeling motivated right now, but being able to fight through that and get out and do it anyways. That's where that mindset comes in. So you can kind of relate that to anyone, really. If someone training for the Olympics versus someone training for a 5K or the weekend warrior type thing, right? And as far as people with relatives, or you mentioned nieces who are competing at maybe a higher level, I think one of the most important things for people to understand is that athletes are really good at hiding the struggle. So, we put up this wall, like saying, I can do everything. I can do all the hard things. I can go to school and ace my exams. I can go to all these extra practices. Oh, you want me to play on the club basketball team? Sure, too, as well. Sure, I can do that too. But meanwhile, inside, they're really struggling. The thought process is, how am I going to do all this? I can't do all this. What if I do play on this club basketball team? They want me because I'm tall and I don't perform, and then they're upset with me. And how am I going to keep up with my studies if I add this other thing? But we don't show that, right? It's that internal struggle. So I would say it's really important to just pay attention to those types of individuals. And even though they're saying, yes, I can do it, yes, I can handle it, I'm fine, make sure you're constantly checking in, keeping those lines of communication open, and without judgment, having them understand, like, you can come and talk to me about these things, and it's okay if you're feeling like you need to take something off your plate. There's no judgment here. Excuse me. I just want you to be happy and and have fun doing what you're doing.
Mm. Well, I think you bring up a few good points there. One is the focus on fun, because I can
Mhm.
tell you now, from a parent with kids that play sport, sometimes the parents lose sight of the fun, not always the child, but the parents that are there. One of our girls play basketball, and we know from, talking to other parents that there are parents that are paying their kids per, how many goals that they shoot, because they want
Yeah.
them to shoot more. But then from a team sport, they're not sharing the ball around because the kid's like, I want to earn more money for shooting more points.
Yes.
So this
Mhm.
is where I think too some parents can listen in and hear this and maybe focus
Mhm.
on the fun part rather than the competitive part of the sport too.
There, there's so many things that you said. I mean, we could do like 5 podcasts on, on all the things that you just said, because I deal with a lot of parents struggling with this very same thing. And I say struggle because it is hard. I mean, there's no manual, right? We're not sent home from the hospital with a manual on how to raise children and to take it further, how to raise a student athlete. It's difficult, right? But I think the most important things to focus on are that fun piece, fun first, development second. Because at the end of the day, if they're not having a good time, it doesn't matter. They're not going to want to play, right? And if you're forcing it, that makes it really, really challenging for them, because now you're bringing in that fear of disappointment too. And remember, I said we're good at hiding that struggle. And if part of that struggle is worrying about disappointing their parents, you're never going to know that. They're not going to tell you those things because they don't want to disappoint you. And in those situations, that it, even just them expressing something that might disappoint the parent. And then with continuing to push them to play and to do things that maybe they don't want to do, like maybe they want to pass the ball, maybe deep down they are a passer, but now they're being forced to shoot more, and all these things. It's just a fast track to burnout. And once they burnout is one of those things that really is super sneaky. Like they don't realize that it's happening until it's right next to them, and then it's all of a sudden, I can't even look at a court or an ice surface or anything anymore, because I just literally, I cannot bring myself to go. That's burnout. And when you are in a situation like that, where the fun is being stripped away, that burnout approaches much faster. And yeah, they might keep going, because again, athletes are really good about doing that kind of stuff and hiding those things from their parents, but they're not going to be having fun. And ultimately down the road, they'll end up resenting their parents for those things, if that makes sense.
Mm.
As far as paying for gold, please don't do that. Please don't do that. If you're doing that and you had no idea that that wasn't something you should do, it's okay. Just stop now. It's not, it's not a healthy thing to get in the habit of doing, especially when, I mean, for any sport, but especially a team sport. It's a team sport, right? And if you're thinking that, oh, if my kid gets the most points every single season, well, they have the opportunity to get recruited. Coaches, they're looking at the team part of it too. And if your child isn't passing the ball when they're supposed to pass the ball, they're going to put a little note in their notepad and their, whatever, saying not a team player, because at the end of the day, it's a team sport and they want a team player. So it's just not a good thing to get in the habit of doing. So it's okay if you're doing it, just, stop now.
Well, that's it. And, this is just the local league, so all different ranges of kids and abilities, essentially, as we thought, joining to have fun. And then, if you want to do rep basketball, you can do that. There's, ranges for kids here that you can then go into that team, which is obviously taking it to the next level. But yeah, it is very interesting being a parent with kids in sport, and especially more of a team sport, because I grew up in dance. So my girls dance, but they also play basketball. And I tell you, I get more stressed sitting at a basketball game, watching kids push and shove and, go to tactics that I think you wouldn't need to do that if you focus more on, how you were, your ball handling skills or that sort of thing. And that gets me more upset, because for me, I think, in dance, there isn't that. You're not competing against other people at the same time. There's not that contact sport. And then when you do team events, you're working together in a team. So you're trying to be in unison, you're trying to help each other to do a lift. So I've never really experienced having that sort of, not competitive, but more of that body contact stuff that I'm like, oh, that looks like it's going too far, sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I do want to say, I love that they're doing dance and basketball. I think that the more sports that kids can play growing up, the better off they're going to be, and for different reasons at different ages, if that makes sense. So when they're younger and they're playing multiple sports, they're developing other motor skills that are really important for, as they get older, hand-eye coordination, foot-eye coordination, that sort of thing. And you talk about dance, I mean, the balance that's involved and everything, and then they can, that benefits them in basketball, and then vice versa too. Basketball, the things that they're doing in basketball can also help them out with dance as well. And so then when they get to that point where they're ready to just pick one, if they, want to become a more serious athlete in one sport or the other, they're going to be so much more well-rounded as an overall athlete than someone who's specialized starting very young in just one sport. And as you get older, it's really important to keep playing other sports too, because now you're talking about the wear and tear on their bodies, right? That same repetitive movement over and over and over again without doing anything else to sort of build up the other muscles that they aren't using. It leaves them more prone to injury because of that repetition, right? We're seeing a lot of players in the NHL, for instance, who are young entering the NHL, which is the National Hockey League, and having to have a hip replacement, at like 20. And it's because of that repetitive motion over and over again that they just, they didn't do other things. And on the flip side, you have other athletes who attribute their success to certain sports, to playing other things when they were growing up, right? They become a better, well-rounded athlete in doing multiple sports. And now there is a flip side to that too, where it's like, okay, well, you shouldn't be doing them all at the same time. Like if you have an athlete who's playing 5 sports all at the same time, that's not good either. That's not what I'm saying. But, having seasons for each sport and going into different sports per season is ideal and is really beneficial for kids overall.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. And I'd say half of the work that I do in the Pilates studio is with just general people, or I've got athletes that are coming in that are coming for cross training so that they don't injure themselves in the sport that they're doing
Yes.
or their weekend activities and that sort of thing. So I always say to them, Pilates is like the activity that allows you to do all these other things without causing injury, because we will address. So I get a lot of golfers that come into the studio that only swing that club to the one side.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I make them do? We do rotation to the other side. So things like that. And if I, at the minute I've got a young dancer and a young footballer. And so we are really trying to work those opposing muscle groups that they, don't tend to work on, or working with different tempos that, speeds and things that they're not used to doing, or that may come up occasionally that their body might not be ready for. So that's one of the reasons
Yeah.
that I love doing Pilates and, part of the work that I do as well.
I personally love Pilates, and I wish I would have discovered it sooner. When I was in college from 2001 to 2005, and we did yoga. We would have once a week, a yoga instructor would come in and we would do team yoga, which I loved. And it was for the same type of reasons, to move get other muscle groups going and that sort of thing. And then it wasn't until right before I got married in 2016 that I discovered Pilates it's a mega reformer. Is that right? The
Yeah,
reformer?
you can have, yeah, the reformer. Yep.
I fell in love with it. And now I backtrack. I'm an athlete who was used to, my mindset was you go to the gym and you lift heavy weights. Right? That was what I grew up knowing back, when I was a child of the 80s and 90s. And so to try something like this, in my head, I thought it would be a little bit similar to yoga, challenging, but not super challenging. Oh my gosh, did it kick my butt. I remember after my first class, I went home to my then fiance and I was like, that was literally the hardest thing I have ever put my body through. I mean, I was shaking. I was so fatigued for the rest of the day. Like I literally laid on the couch. I was like, that was so hard, but in such a good way. I loved it so much. And I became addicted to it, to the point where I just remember thinking to myself, I wish I would have had this so much sooner, like back in my playing days, to do exactly what you just said. I can't say enough nice things about Pilates. It's just such a great workout.
Oh, well, that's amazing. But yes, I do find, especially with my young athletes that come in, my dancer at the minute is, learning to do walkovers and flip the leg over and stuff. And when she first came in, I'm like, you don't have the upper body strength. You don't have that shoulder stability. You're not practicing that at dancing. So, adding in more extension, but loaded and, building up on that and all the rest of it. So we've been able to sort of tailor her Pilates sessions to what her goals are in her sport too. So I think that's
Mm.
always beneficial. It doesn't have to be Pilates, maybe you find a great strength and conditioning coach or
Right.
whoever it may be. But especially, I think it's the side as a young athlete, a lot of parents think, they're young. Their body will be fine. It's handling the sport fine. It doesn't need anything else. And that's where I would argue, even if it's just one session a week, or seeing somebody a couple of times and getting a bit of a home program to add in, it can really support them. And I was just saying to my dancer the other day, teaching her how to extend properly so that she doesn't get degeneration and pain when she's older, when she's finished dance
Mhm.
in 20 years
Mhm.
time, is also important as well.
So important. And I remember growing up, my dad saying those things to me too. Like, we need to protect your knees, right? Because a lot of female athletes blow out their knees, their ACL, and they're having to have these surgeries at young ages. And I still see it happening with a lot of soccer players. But so he was always of the mindset, like, let's do these exercises to build up the muscles around to protect the knees. And the same thing about eventually finishing, like at some point we do stop, right? And we would like our bodies to continue to work for us, beyond our playing days. And I do think it's so important. And, the cross training is really, really valuable. And as far as athletes starting to work out, I have found that a lot of athletes are starting really, really young with weight training, and they're not with people who understand their bodies and that sort of thing. And so I think it is important to understand, yes, you should be doing other things to build your muscles and that sort of thing, but when they're younger than 13, 14, body weight stuff, Pilates is, I have never been so strong than I was after doing Pilates regularly. Like, that's just such a good workout. But swimming is really good. There are things that you can do to build up their muscles in a way that you don't have to, sort of be throwing them under a lot of weight when their bodies just aren't ready for that kind of training, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I want to segue, you've obviously had so much experience with women's sport. In, your opinion, what are the differences between men and women's sport and the expectations that are placed on women in comparison to men?
Well, I can speak from my personal experience growing up being the only girl in an all, not only even on an all boys team, but in an all boys league. Like, it was rare if I played against a team that had another girl on it. Um, it was really challenging. And again, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and, I'd like to say things have maybe changed a little bit since then, but honestly, I don't think that they have. Even when I came home from playing overseas and joined a men's league here, I was still experiencing the same stuff that I was experiencing being the only female when I was a kid. Um, so, and again, that was also one of those invisible barriers that was difficult for me to get through, was that self-talk of needing to be perfect every single time I step out on the ice, because I know that people are just waiting for me to mess up just even a little bit to tell me that I don't belong out here. And so that was a constant battle for me that has carried on with me throughout my entire life. And I've been doing a lot of work with the tools that I now teach my athletes to sort of reverse a lot of that, that perfectionism. But that's what it was like for me being a girl playing with boys. They're just, it's like the boys have to prove that they don't, the what's the saying? Oh, I'm gonna mess this up. Um, they have to prove that they don't belong, whereas I'm constantly having to prove that I do, something along those lines. I'm really bad with sayings, but that's what I felt like. Any slip up of mine, and it was like, oh yeah, well, she's a girl, she doesn't belong out here, right? And I carried that with me into college, and in college it's all females, right? But I still had that same mindset, like, any mess up, any mistake, they're on to me, like, they know that I don't belong here. And so I think that was part of my experience growing up playing with boys. But on the flip side, I feel like it also made me a stronger person, just having to um battle against people who were bigger than me and stronger than me and faster than me. It forced me to think faster. And so I think it did make me a better hockey player to a certain degree, but I don't know if I would try, like, I would like to go back and not have that feeling, that constant anxiety of like, oh, who's going to say something to me today? Or, I have to be perfect and that sort of thing. I don't know if that really answers your question. I guess that's just more of my personal experience. And then, there's the things that, like the pro teams are, they're not the same as the pro men's teams. I feel like we're getting there, maybe slowly but surely. Hopefully by the time my daughter is an adult, maybe they'll be equal pay. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, that's just kind of what I experienced growing up.
Well, talking about that negative self talk, I think that's something so many people can relate to. We've all been there, whether or not we felt like a fish out of water, or,
Mhm.
like you said, we're just training for something and we're like, we're just not really good at this. This is just hard. And as you said, I think it can make you go, yeah, well, I'm just going to train harder. I'm going to show people I'm going to overcome it. But for some people, it can just be like, yeah, well, this is just too hard and I'm done. So, is there a way that people can help coach themselves through those difficult, periods where they have this negative self talk to keep going?
So yes, it's difficult. And it's oftentimes helpful to have someone hold you accountable and to teach you kind of how to go through this process, because it's not, I always say to my athletes, it's not like putting food in a microwave and 30 seconds later it's warm, right? It's like it takes some time. And granted, when I was going through these things, sometimes it was years. It took me years to kind of, number one, figure out what was going on, and number two, um, figure out how to fix it, if that makes sense. So it's not years anymore. The athletes in my program, we're moving past these things in a couple of weeks, months, that sort of thing. But I would say the number one tool I think that's really important for everyone, and you can start doing this immediately, is diaphragmatic breathing. That's also known as belly breathing. It's when you're using the entirety of your lungs. All the air is going into the bottom of your lungs first. Your belly expands out. That's why it's also known as belly breathing. And you're just, when you do that, it's a natural calming mechanism for the mind and body. It's like this elixir. It's just, you take a couple deep breaths and it's just, oh, I feel calmer now. So there's, and also coupled with that, giving yourself something neutral to focus on. I call it a mental focal point. So counting, for instance, if you wanted to count the length of the inhale and the length of the exhale, what you're doing with that, box breathing is a very common one that I teach my kids. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, repeat, right? And what that does is, whatever is the negative self-talk, that story that we're creating in our minds, that has control, right? But when you shift gears and you start to do your breathing and you use the focal point, the counting, now you're giving your brain something neutral to think about. It pulls the focus away from that scary story and it puts it on the numbers. And the reason why that's important is because so often when that negative self-talk starts to happen, we try to just push it away. No, I'm not thinking about that right now. I'm not thinking about that right now. But when we do that, it just gets stronger. It just comes back with a vengeance. And it's so hard to just turn that off. So instead, we give our conscious mind something else to think about, because our conscious mind can only focus on so many things at one time. So if you're giving it the numbers to count, or even you can involve some visualization, or but for beginners, I would say the numbers it works really well. You're focusing on the numbers. That story starts to fade away a little bit. And then from there, you can go into the next tool. And depending on what the situation is, that might change. But I would say that that's probably the number one thing that I would start with, is kind of learning diaphragmatic breathing, giving yourself something neutral to think about. But it all starts with that self-awareness. So you have to understand that your brain is thinking these things in order to understand, oh, I need to use a tool. So, there's a lot that goes into it, but if you can start to pay attention a little bit, oh, my mind is going again. I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to start to do some breathing, focus on the numbers, and then that can help to sort of calm you down a little bit. And then from there, you can maybe adjust your language. The things that you're saying to yourself, maybe you can adjust. And a quick tool that I give my athletes to do that is pretend that they're talking to their best friend. Say if they see their best friend, Or if you're a lot of parents on here, your child, if you see your child saying all these negative things to themselves, what would you say to them, right? You wouldn't say, "Oh yeah, you are terrible. You should just quit." Right? You wouldn't. You would say you would be reassuring. So now identify that and now say that to yourself. That's hard, but it is a good sort of starting point to adjust that language, that self-talk.
Mm. And I think, as you said, it's that self awareness. So the more that you can catch yourself and build that self awareness, then the easier
Mhm.
that step's going to get. And I know when I go for a run, there can be a point on my run where I'm thinking, I just want to stop right now. This is getting hard. I'm getting tired. And I switch my mind when that hits and I focus on my breathing. And I
Yeah.
just make sure that I've got a nice, even rhythm of my breathing going, and even if I have to slow down my pace a little bit whilst focusing on my breathing to get through that section, it helps so much. And then
Mhm.
it's like you said, your mind resets once you've gotten through that, and then it feels easier to keep going. So I know
Yeah.
even when I'm mid workout that can help as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anytime, really. And you don't even have to be working out. It could be during the workday. It could be, I don't know, prepping for a difficult conversation, anytime, really. It's performance is performance. And, we're performing right now just as a surgeon performs when they do surgery. So it can be applied in all areas of your life, really.
So let's talk about your book, because whenever I speak to an author, I'm always really curious around one, why, what was their why for wanting to write the book? And then number two, how they came up with the name of their book. Because I think I find titles for anything, let alone, like podcasts and blogs and things hard. So,
Hmm.
picking one for your book, I would imagine would be even harder.
Oh my gosh, how much time do you have? I I am really bad with coming up with titles too. Since the emergence of Chat GPT, though, that has been very helpful for me, I will say. I'll just tell it, kind of what I'm thinking and then it tells me some titles. But yeah, to coming up with my book title, it was honestly one of the last things that I did as I was writing my book because I could not think of something. And again, that perfectionistic mentality came back where it's like this title has to be perfect. And so I find the one that I do love the title of my book, but it did take me a while to come to it. I had lists all over the place and I was asking people their opinions and that sort of thing. But essentially it comes down to, you know, self-acceptance and self-worth are so important when you think about confidence because self-acceptance is understanding that we have strengths and that we have weaknesses and accepting that about ourselves. Like we're not going to be perfect and that's okay. And that's what makes us who we are. And self-worth ties into that too. Understanding for athletes in particular as they read, as it pertains to my book, I talk a lot about sport and identity and understanding that their worth is not tied to how well they perform in any given day is a really important concept that I try to teach my athletes. So those two things, and then if you're solid in those areas, the confidence comes through. You just feel more confident in the things that you're going out to execute on, whatever that may be. And the empowered athlete, I love the word empowered because that's what I feel I'm doing for these athletes. I'm empowering them to be able to work through whatever types of adversity comes their way. Because at the end of the day, it's not about eliminating adversity. That's impossible. That's a perfect world and that just doesn't exist. So it's about knowing that those things are going to come no matter what, and I have the tools that I need to work through whatever that is. And that's where the confidence comes from. So empowering with the tools that they need to feel confident in any situation, whether that's in sport or in life.
Mm. Well, I know reading it, when I read it, I went the empowered athlete, self confidence, self acceptance, and self worth. I thought these are the three things, me thinking back as being, a dancer, that I really needed to work on at the time because they weren't very good. Because, like you were saying, that perfectionist tendency comes in and you always want to be perfect. So you never feel that any of these three things
Yeah.
are probably where they should be, because you constantly
Right.
feel that you're never quite good enough. So I was
Right.
like, this is perfect for an athlete potentially, but also just anybody that has perfectionist tendencies, because
Mhm.
these are the three areas that you really do need to work on.
Absolutely. And I've gotten a lot of feedback actually about the book because, obviously I wrote the book for athletes because I work with athletes, but the feedback that I've gotten has been so beautiful in that I have parents who read it and and they say like, this is not just for our kids and our athletes. Like this is for everyone because you're right. We all deal with those things. We all at some point struggle with something that having to do with any of those, those concepts. And so I do it is nice when I get that feedback from parents who will read it with their kid or they'll read it before their child reads it or whatever. I actually one of the reviews on Amazon was, I don't know if it was a man or woman. I just assumed it was a woman, but she said that it was picked for their book club. And I had to laugh because I was like, oh, that's an interesting pick for a book club. And so I thought she was not going to be happy with it. But she was like, initially, I wasn't happy with the pick because it's not like your typical book club book. But she's like, but by the end of it, she said, I had gained so much. Like I had, it just, it was so useful. And so that made me smile and it made me happy.
Well, yes, even so, I always do research and SEO research when I'm coming up with the title for the podcast. And so I put self confidence in as one of the SEO words. And so when it pops up, it tells you the age range of people that search that word and then also the percentage of it. So there was the biggest percent was actually the 35 to 44-year age group, and it was
Wow.
44% of all searches. So even
Wow.
then, it wasn't, another section was 18 to 25 and then 25 to 34. But the biggest was, yeah, 35 to 44,
Yeah,
which even I was like, it's still applicable because, I have those thoughts, sometimes
for
daily
sure.
thinking about things. And then, yeah, seeing that made me go, this is a thing for everybody, but even not
Mhm.
necessarily just a young athlete, just for people as they age. Self-confidence is that thing that we're always thinking about.
Absolutely. And that's really fascinating. I've actually never done the SEO search and I find that to be fascinating and it makes sense, and like because like you said, you sometimes experience that daily. And I'm the same way. I'm homeschooling my children. Well, my 5-year-old right now. My daughter is about to turn 3. And every day I'm like, am I doing this right? Like, am I ruining him? And all of these things. And so that again, it's self-confidence comes back to, and then I go to my tools and just kind of work through the day. But yeah, it applies to everyone at any moment, really.
So, what's one of the first sort of steps we can do that if we know that our self-confidence is low, that we can start to take just to help to work on that?
Well, I would say one of the first things is recognizing and accepting it. By acceptance, I mean it's okay. There's nothing wrong. It's okay to not feel confident all of the time. And I think that's the kind of the first step. And then from there, there are resources out there. I mean, we're kind of in this day and age of the self-help day and age, right? Where there's so many things out there. I would try not to get bogged down by your Google searches. It's like a doctor saying, don't Google that, right? But finding a good resource or someone, that you feel like you connect with, is a good starting point. But ultimately, I would get into breathing. There's so many meditation apps. I love tapping too. Tapping is really, I've just gotten into that. I think that's great. But learn how to get into the diaphragmatic breathing, start to recognize when your mind might start to go and create that story, and then tune into your breathing with your focal point. And then from there, really pay attention to the things that you're saying to yourself. And it's really helpful to start to write these things down. A lot of people won't want to do that because it's like, "Ugh, I don't want to, like I don't want to bring that up again, but
Feelings.
yeah, exactly. Ugh, go away. But by writing it down, number one, it gets it out of your head. When it's in your head, it has so much power and control and creates so much chaos. But when you get it out of your head and onto paper, now it's something tangible that you can work with. You can see it. And oftentimes you'll look at these things and be like, well, that's not as scary as I thought, right? Or whatever it is.
So, if somebody is listening in and maybe, they have a really full plate, maybe it's themselves and they're working and they're training and they feel they're listening in and going, "Yes, this is sounding like something I need to work on, but I don't have a heap of time or a heap of money to kind of delve into this. I know
Yeah.
I can do a bit of breathing. What else can they do in their sort of own time, a little bit here and there, just to slowly build on, the self confidence and self acceptance piece?"
Yeah, so that's a good question. Um, I would say definitely with the breathing, always start with the breathing. And what I would suggest, and I suggest this to my athletes too, but as adults, I think it's maybe even more important to get up a couple minutes earlier in the morning. A lot of us, will wait till our alarm goes off. And as soon as that alarm goes off, we're like, boom, we're going with the day, right? We're checking emails, we're out the door, we're dealing with kids yelling and screaming, we're making lunches, all the things, right? So I would say, try to get up a little bit earlier. And I'm not saying, 3 hours earlier or anything crazy. Start with like 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And then, as you maybe start to feel like you like this kind of thing, you can start to increase it gradually. But 10, 15 minutes earlier, and just go into a quiet spot in the house, and it's a really good time for you to kind of practice the breathing. Do some of the deep breath work, use the focal point, use the meditation app. There's so many really good ones out there. And just start to, start that day off in a calm, controlled manner that's doing something that's positive for you. And it's not rushed. It's not looking at your emails. It's not, just jumping into the day and then chaos ensuing for as the day goes on, right? When you start your day off this way, number one, it's really peaceful and nice, and it gives you that time to yourself, which I feel like a lot of us are lacking these days. But number two, as things come up throughout the day for you that cause you to struggle or cause that self-doubt to come in or whatever, it makes it a little bit easier for you to handle that, because not only are you getting up and you're starting your day in this positive way, but you're actually practicing a tool that as you continue to practice it, you'll find that you just naturally go to it when you're in a time of stress or self-doubt, if that makes sense. So you know what I mean? Like, it's not like you'll get to this point where you don't have to think about it anymore. You just recognize that you're feeling stressed out, and you just all of a sudden you find yourself doing the breathing. So I really feel like that is a good starting point. And with the I'm not with the morning routine type thing, you start with the breathing, and then from there, you can maybe recite a couple affirmations that, which is adjusting your self-talk. And again, that's where if you kind of have written down some common things that you notice yourself saying to yourself that aren't very helpful, you can flip that sentence around to make it more beneficial. And that's something that you can say after you do your breathing exercises, excuse me. And I would also suggest find a really good book, something that's not work related, not school related, anything like that, not even parenting related, just something that is positive and uplifting for you, and just read like a couple pages, 1 page, 2 pages. Because again, the whole idea is, or listen to an uplifting podcast. The whole idea is you're putting good things into your mind right when the day starts. So you're starting off in this calm, peaceful way, practicing the breathing with the focal point. You say some positive affirmations to yourself, which is going to over time help adjust your self-talk. And then you put something good into your brain from a good book or a podcast or something like that. And I think that in doing that daily, 10, 15 minutes, that's it, you'll start to notice you're feeling better about yourself. And by practicing those things, you'll realize that you're starting to implement them at times where normally you wouldn't before.
Mm. And I think that's great because I think sometimes our go to is to pick up the phone, scroll on social media,
Mhm.
read the news. And again, all of these things are putting us in that fight or flight state rather than that parasympathetic rest and digest state, as all of those things you were mentioning will do. And that in itself, if we are checking the email or opening the phone straight away or reading the news, it's going to set us almost on a reaction sort of start rather than us
Exactly.
choosing our start to the day.
Exactly. It's what I call red zone. I tell my kids all the time, the second you pick up that phone, whether you realize it or not, you're in red zone, because the social media comes out. Now you're comparing yourself to somebody else. You're checking an email, now you're worrying about something, right? You're seeing your to-do list, and now you're like stressing out about all the things you have to get done in the day. So keep the phone on airplane mode is helpful, because I think you can still utilize your excuse me, your meditation apps even if the phone is on airplane mode. Just keep it on airplane mode until you've made it through that 10 to 15 minutes, and then you can turn it off. And then again, as you open up the emails and stuff, it'll be coming in differently than, because you've done these things leading up to it. But yes, absolutely spot on with what you said. Yep.
Mm. And I also want to tie it into, if you are doing a workout, most workouts have generally some warm up portion of the workout to start to connect to your body, build that body awareness, potentially connect to your breath. I know in our Pilates classes, like we use massage balls. So we're getting that touch feedback, stimulating the vagus nerve, again, dropping into that parasympathetic state. So there is a reason behind, not just warming up your muscles, but there is a reason behind doing a warm up, even if it's just for a couple of minutes. So if you're not adding in a warm up to maybe your own trainings and things, at home, maybe that's something you can look at doing too, just to prep your body and your mind for the training that's coming.
Yes, absolutely. That's so funny that you say that, because I do talk about that all the time with my athletes and coaches. I said, well, you do a pregame warm up, a pre-practice, like continuous warm up to warm up your body, right? To prep it for what's to come. Why don't we do that for the brain? So yes, absolutely. It's the same thing. It's very, very important, if not more so.
And I think that's where people think the warm up is really just a physical thing to get the muscles moving, the circulation going. But if you can tie that into just being more aware and present in your body, and maybe if you've been listening in today going, okay, I haven't added in any breathing before, or that focus on my breath, add that into your next couple and see how it changes even just your mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that you can start at any time, like literally right now. You could do it right now while you're listening.
Yes, go off and do it now. Now, before we finish off, I always ask my guests if there's one piece of health advice that people listening in could go off and instigate straight away after listening to this podcast, what would it be?
Well, the breathing, it's funny because I feel like I've said that so many times, but I'm such a firm believer in breath work. The breathing for sure. But since we were just talking about social media, I would say try to limit your time on social media. I think that is really good for our mental health overall. Is trying to, or maybe doing sort of like an inventory of who you follow, how each person makes you feel. Are you feeling good when you look at their stuff? Are you feeling not good? That sort of thing. And maybe just kind of limit the amount of time you're on social media in general, because that starts the comparison, and the self-talk changes, and we create the stories and that sort of thing. So I would say those would be maybe my top two things. The breathing, start implementing that, and then maybe limit the social media time.
Love it. I think there are two things that we can probably all focus on doing. And even if you're not someone that you think, oh, I'm not on social media a lot, you can get, like, the phone can tell you how many minutes you're on social media. And I think sometimes that's a good check in, because sometimes we don't realize how long we're on there, because we might pop on a couple of times a day. But then at the end of the day, if you look back at the time, it might be 20, 30, 40 minutes that you're like, if you're saying, oh, I just don't have time to exercise, or I don't have time to start that hobby, that's 20 minutes in your day or 30 minutes in your day that you could be doing that. So I think even sometimes tracking it can be helpful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have all that stuff on phones now. So you can, like, they break it down where you're spending all your time. So yeah, that's a great idea to check that out and see it. I mean, it adds up really fast.
Yeah. So where can our listeners reach out and connect with you, and then also grab your book?
Yeah, so I love receiving emails. I'm very much a question and answer type of person. So if you send me an email, I get excited and I will respond. And I just love that. So my email address is Danielle at ocppt.com. My website is www.ocppt.com. I'm also on Instagram, Danielle __McDonough. And my book is on Amazon. And I thought as a gift, I would be happy to send you a link and everyone can have the free ebook version.
Oh,
And it's not,
amazing.
to me, it's not the same, but yeah, but I'm happy to send that along. And so then, yeah, you have the ebook version there. But yeah, it is on Amazon as well.
Awesome. Well, I'll link that up all in the show notes for listeners, so you can head on there to check that all out. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Danielle. I think this is, a really important topic. We're going to share this podcast for those listening in. It's coming out in May for Mental Health Awareness Month. So, maybe it's not yourself. Maybe you have, a relative or a young athlete in your life. Definitely share this and then pass on Danielle's details, because I think the more that people, have those connections and those resources, then, the more it's going to help in the long run, especially with our young athletes.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.